Welcome to another edition of Krown Gridrion Nation on TSN, presented by PointsBet. He is Mike in Toronto, there is Gord in Vancouver, and I am Jim here on Football Island with another edition of the 2-Minute Offense. The Brown brothers are at it again for Illinois. The London natives once again playing a key role in a win for the Illini over a ranked team. John Mechie III, consistently the favorite target for Alabama. He also found the end zone in a surprisingly tight game against LSU. Peterborough's Jared Wayne was doing what he does best, and that's finding the end zone for number 25 Pitt with a win over Duke. It was a very short stay for Wake Forest in the top 10 after a roller coaster ride of a game. 58-55 loss. Luigi Villain had a good game, half a sack and 3 tackles. Number 17 Ole Miss kept rolling with a handy win over Liberty. Tavius Robinson on that defensive line from Guelph, Ontario with 3 tackles. Alonzo Adai had 6 tackles. Akeem Messidor had 4 and a tackle for loss, but it wasn't enough as West Virginia was outmatched against number 11 Oklahoma State. No big numbers from the defensive side from Canadians in the Penn State win over Maryland. Mateo Johnson continues to produce from the tight end position. 3 catches for 23 yards. A fumble recovery and a tackle for Enoch McConzo as Coastal Carolina cruises to a 20-point win over Georgia Southern. And MAC action from last week. Curtis Rourke is back on track. 288 yards passing, 3 strikes to the end zone, and 44 yards rushing in a narrow win over Miami, Florida. Never before have we seen top 5 Canadian prospects automatically get multiple offers from Power 5 schools. Why is this, Mike?
Well, I think a lot of it is just motivation from the kids. I mean, they look ahead of them, and A, they're getting better coaching for one thing, so they've got that option ahead of them now. And secondly, I think that the kids now maybe have, with no disrespect to USPORTS at all, because I think you all know how I feel about that level, but I think they see that potential to a higher level. And, you know, when you see guys out there who have paved the way in recent memories, and I'm talking about the last 2 or 3 years, you're looking at Chase Claypool and Chase Brown and Eamon Ogbamiga, and you're looking at, of course, Chuba Hubbard, and you know, so many guys who have gone to the NCAA who have players go before them and say, hey, I can do that too. Where maybe a lot of people didn't even think that the NCAA was an option before, they do now.
I agree, and there's also a lot more avenues for them to get their exposure down south of the line. You know, university programs are better recruiters than they ever have been. They cast a wider net. They don't miss a lot. Social media has been an absolute game changer for kids like our Canadian guys who come from, at least by the American standard, non-traditional areas. There's lots of travel teams that will go down to the States, even if it's just for 7-on-7 competition. So there's opportunities for exposure there. And we should also point out that a number of the top Canadian prospects, these guys are going down to prep schools and are playing their final years in the prep ranks in the States, where above all else, not only do they get the exposure, they also in a lot of cases get the opportunity to reclassify and play an extra year over what they could do in the Canadian system. So there's a lot of things working in their favor that are pushing this in the right direction, and let's not discount that there's a lot of talent available in this country and a lot of people playing ball. So it should be something that's a fertile recruiting ground for big U.S. schools, and it's nice to see it continuing to trend that direction.
Is the pipeline of Canadians to the NCAA sustainable, or are we simply witnessing a high cycle here, Gord?
No, I think it is sustainable, and I think one of the things, whether we like it or not, I think one of the things it's reflective of is a little bit of a shift in this country's cultural consciousness. You know, that monolith that is the NFL and the American game is becoming more and more culturally relevant in this country, again, whether we like it or not. So I do think that the younger generations are more oriented towards going south of the line than they ever have been before. And that's not to discount what it's been like in previous generations, but I do think that there's more appeal down there south of the line. The other thing that makes it sustainable, is participation rates in this country. I talked about it before. We do still need, though, to bounce back from the pandemic in some places and increase that footprint of participation. I'm looking particularly in my neck of the woods in BC, where it looks like participation numbers, we're struggling to kind of hold firm at where we were prior to the pandemic. You know, BC high school football, I can speak from inside experience. You know, it was a good bounce back season for a lot of programs, but we had more forfeitures and more folds than I've ever seen since I've been in BC high school football this year as programs struggled to come out of the pandemic. That needs to turn around fast in places like here if this trend is going to continue.
And let's not forget, for years and years and years and years, the best athletes in this country all gravitated toward hockey. Not the case anymore. There's football, there's basketball, there's baseball. Hockey's losing some of the best athletes in this country to other sports, and football's a beneficiary of that.
Well, we have 5 players currently on a high cycle, and that is why they are on our stateside 5. Starting off with Illinois and Sidney Brown, who led all with 7 tackles and a win over 23-ranked Minnesota. Let's track way back to some midweek MAC action. Curtis Rourke of Ohio, he's back slinging them again. 23 of 32 for 288, 3 TDs, added 44 yards rushing in a win over Miami of Florida. Smack in the middle of the 5, once again, Jared Wayne with a touchdown to open the scoring for Pitt in their win over Duke. 5 receptions, 81 yards in that trip to the Promised Land. It was a surprisingly tight win over LSU, and John Mechie III of Alabama made a major contribution. 9 receptions, 73 yards, and a tutty. And another big game for Chase Brown. 33 carries, 150 yards in that win over Minnesota for Illinois. Brown now only 149 yards away from 1,000 with 2 games to go. Coming up, let's head on over to the USPORTS Playoffs. In Canada, it's the end of the regular season and the beginning of the playoffs in our 3-minute warning. Let's start with the final week of the AUS. St. FX finishes with a perfect 6-0 season after a win over Acadia. Malcolm Bussey led the way with 215 yards rushing. The first place X-Men will host Acadia, while third place Bishops will travel to Sackville to face Mount A. Can West, Calgary went to Saskatchewan needing a win and a little bit of help elsewhere. Huskies, though, not in a charitable mood. Clovis Lumeka, what a day for this guy. 4.5 tackles, a sack, a forced fumble, an INT, a blocked punt, recovered for a touchdown. Man, Green Dogs finished first. Calgary forced to check the scoreboard from the coast. And in the end, they did not like what they witnessed. UBC with a 3-point win over Alberta. Thunderbirds' Isaiah Knight, the reason for the postseason. 23 carries, 146 yards, and 2 trips to the Promised Land. Next week in the C-Dub semis, Manitoba and Alberta will tangle in 1, while UBC heads to the Prairies to face the Huskies. Playoff action starting in the queue. Jonathan Senecal tosses for 332. Gerard Taylor on the receiving end for 127 of those yards. And the Carabins comfortably get by Sherbrooke. Much the same story in Quebec City. Arnaud Desjardins goes 24 of 29 with 3 TD strikes. The Laval defense allows only 9 yards as the clock strikes midnight on Concordia. Dunsmore Cup goes like this. Sunday at Sepsum, 8th time in a row for Red versus Blue. OUA divisional semifinals, and Queens looks just that good. Great defense, and Rashid Tucker running for 2 tutties. Gets the Gales to the East Division final in style. Meanwhile in Toronto, Ottawa's JP Simakinda torches the varsity defense for 124 rushing as the GGs win by 10. Over to the West Division, Guelph quarterback Sean Lal gets hot as a $2 pistol. 20 of 24 for 261 and 3 touchdown passes as the Griffins punch their ticket to the division final with a win at Laurier. A grinding offensive line and timely defense was all the Western Mustangs would need against Waterloo. Trey Ford, in his final game as a Warrior, threw for 305. Division finals are set for Saturday. Ottawa is a heavy underdog going to Kingston to face the Gales. And Western tries to avenge their only loss of the year, which was against Guelph. But this time, they tangle in London. The defending Vanier Cup champion Calgary Dinos did not qualify for the postseason. Let that sink in. There's a whole lot of angles to this story, so go ahead, Gord, pick an angle.
Well, one of my angles is that it was just a litany of different errors, and this team very much, to me, played like a relatively inexperienced team at this level. You know, I was talking to you guys before we went on the air about the fact that the astounding statistic for me from Calgary this season, they go 2-4. They outgained their opposition in all 6 games this season and only win 2 of them. But the thing is, there isn't an ongoing theme of it's always the same thing shooting themselves in the foot. Some weeks it was turnovers. Some weeks it was settling for 3 too much instead of going for, scoring touchdowns. Some weeks it was special teams mistakes like this last week where they gave up a lengthy interception return and then they also gave up a block punt for a touchdown. So it was finding new ways to beat themselves pretty much every week, unfortunately. These are the types of growing pains that a lot of programs go through when they're just at the wrong part of the cycle, and that may be all that this is for Calgary. But I will say for them moving forward, the post-Philpott era looms very large for Calgary because they just wasted 2 all-time seasons from all-time great talents, and they're likely both gone next year. It'll be interesting to see how and if they can reload, as they'll also have to replace their starting quarterback.
We've got 4 conferences across the country. Who has hand in each of them in the playoffs, in your opinion, Mike?
We'll start out west. It's obviously Saskatchewan now because not only are they coming off a big win against Calgary, but the Dinos aren't in the playoffs. So that road is absolutely wide open for them at this stage, although there's a couple of teams that may have thoughts about that. In Ontario, I still think it's going to be Western. Queens looked exceptionally good against Carleton on the weekend, but how good is Carleton? There's the question there. And I also think mentally, Western looks at Queens as just another school at this stage, which may actually favor Queens. Queens is still looking at Western as that behemoth from London, and until you knock them off, I think that Ontario goes in that direction. In Quebec, earlier in the season, I would have said Laval. Now I say Montreal. The head-to-heads have been great, and they've proven that they can score. The offense may have been a question compared to Laval at the beginning of the season, but they've answered all of those, including a 21-point win over Laval and 2 victories over the Rougeois this season. And out west, it's St. FX, although I don't think they're as dominant as their record is. Basically everybody other than SMU gave them a really tough battle this year, so they're the favorites, but I don't think it's one-sided.
I would agree that there's pretty clear favorites in the 3 large-scale conferences at least. And out west, Saskatchewan looks like they're in a really good position. I mean, the Canada West tends to be topsy-turvy up and down, but Saskatchewan is 3-0 against the 3 other remaining teams in the conference with an average margin of victory of over 20 points. They blew out all 3 teams that are left. They get UBC to start with this week, and then the winner of Manitoba, Alberta after that. Things are setting up very nicely for the Huskies, so long as they stay healthy, because Adam Mackert didn't play this past week. That could be a pretty big issue. In Ontario, I'm interested because the team that happens to get through to face the Western Mustangs is the Guelph Griffins, which was the one team that beat the Western Mustangs this year. So I'm really interested to see if Guelph can make that magic happen again. It's going to be an incredibly tall task, but let's not rule them out. And then in Quebec, I agree with you. I like what Montreal's doing. They're trending in a really good direction. And I'll be very honest, I haven't watched a lot of the AUS games very closely this year, but I have seen score lines, a lot of things going down to the wire. Parity's always great in that conference. So St. FX could get upturned, and I wouldn't bat an eye. But they have gone through the season undefeated. They look like the clear favorite. I just don't know how things are going to turn out in that conference.
Coming up, it's our offensive line GOAT selections. Let's go to the Cjfl Playoffs in the PFC. 3 lead changes in the last 3 minutes between the Edmonton Huskies and Hilltops. It's capped off with 21 seconds left. Damon Dutton to Dylan Heinz, and the Saskatoon Hilltops sneak away with a 2-point victory at home. Meanwhile, in Regina, the Thunder had an easier time with Winnipeg. Ryan Sokol, 4 receptions for 134 and a tutty. That means Saskatoon and Regina will tangle in the PFC final this weekend. Not as close in BC at the semis. Rams over Valley 39-8. Langley forced 7 turnovers. And the Sun over the VI Raiders 33-0 opening play of the game. An 88-yard kickoff return by Andrew Shipley set the tone. So the Sun will travel to face the Rams this weekend in the BCFC final. And our winner on Twitter of a copy of Gale Force, A History of Queens Football, is Mike Doyle. Mike, we'll have that in the post to you soon, courtesy of KGN on TSN. Welcome back, everyone. Every week, we are looking to pick our Great Canadian College Goat in the PointsBet Great Canadian Goat Search. We pick them by position group and also era by era. Also, with your help throughout the week on Twitter in our polls at KGN on TSN. This week, it's the offensive line, so let's get goating. There's lots to break down, so our panel will present our picks. But you're welcome to tweet back through the week as well. If there's a player we haven't talked about, let us know for our wild card poll. Mike, who is on your list from each era? And will we have to revoke your Kingston passport as a result of your answer?
I know where you're going with that one, and as difficult as it is to not say Mike Shad, I have to not say Mike Shad. Who was absolutely ridiculously dominant for the Gales when I was covering them back in the early 80s. But how can you not say Tony Mandridge? I think you can make the argument that he's the best college player that this country's ever produced. He went down to Michigan State and dominated. Ridiculously, he didn't win the Outland, but he was a two-time Big Ten Offensive Lineman of the Year, and the pancake number he had as a senior was just ridiculous. So it didn't pan out in the pros, but for his senior and junior, or his last 2 years at State, he was just ridiculous. And then in the middle group, I'm going to go with Brett Romberg from the University of Miami, who almost always gets forgotten. And I'll admit, until I did a little bit more research, I went, oh my God, I completely forgot about Brett Romberg, who played at the U when the U was the U. And in his 3 years of starting with Miami, they lost just 2 games. He only gave up 1 sack in 3 years as a starter, won a national championship, won a couple of major bowl games as well. So I think Romberg is obviously the guy from the middle era that we're talking about. And recently, sometimes I think we forget about the more recent guys. And Alaric Jackson at Iowa was just phenomenal. He came in as a freshman, started, here's a guy who didn't play high school football until his junior year. Windsor guy who went across the river to play his high school ball in Detroit. But then, he goes on to Iowa. He's a freshman All-American. He's a 4-year starter. 3 times he's a Big Ten All-Star or All Big Ten selection. And, now on to the LA Rams. So I think maybe we don't give him his props, and I think time will be very kind to his career. But those will be my 3 selections on the O-line.
Well, I can't believe I'm saying this, but whereas Mike went south of the line with all of his choices, I'm going to stay north of the line with most of my choices in terms of where guys played college ball. And I'm going to start with Mike Shad, an absolute standout offensive tackle at Queen's University. He was the first USPORTS CIAU then player drafted in the first round of the NFL draft. I believe he's still the most recent USPORTS player drafted in the first round of the NFL draft as well. Drafted by the Los Angeles Rams in the first round of the draft. Has a decent short NFL career with the Philadelphia Eagles. Maybe didn't live up to his draft pedigree, but a trailblazer and a dominant force in college football. If you're going to get into the first round of the NFL draft playing out of Canada, that's pretty standout, and I can't ignore your efforts. Another guy I should point out, by the way, with local ties, bit of a local legend here that I should mention, Jim Mills, who had a fantastic prep career at Richmond High on a dominant team there, went down to the University of Hawaii, was a standout there, ended up with a successful NFL career playing for the Indianapolis Colts, and then came back and was a Hall of Famer for the BC Lions. So a guy whose resume looms large, but was a standout college player before he even got to the pros. Jim Mills deserves mention here too. In the middle era, again, I'm going to go with some local flavor here. And Jim, you know that this is a guy that I know personally, but Bob Beverage, who happens to be a former coach of mine. This guy was the UBC Athlete of the year they won the Vanier Cup in 1997 as an offensive tackle. Okay, a fantastic college career for Bob Beverage. I believe he was 3-time All-Canadian, academic All-Canadian as well. Went on to have a CFL career with 3 different teams, and then coached for a long time at his alma mater too. But a fantastic decorated college career for that guy really stands out for me. And then in the modern era, it's got to be the good doctor, Laurent Duvernay-Tardif. who was a standout on, I should point out, a not very strong McGill University program, and a guy that started making headlines early on in his USPORTS career, eventually goes on to be drafted, start in the Super Bowl for the Kansas City Chiefs and win a ring. And of course, we know all about his exploits off the field as well. But if you looked at LDT when he was playing in college on a McGill team that had nothing really to pay attention to, he was a guy worth tuning into single-handedly to watch play.
Now, I agree with some of what I hear, not all of it. Victoria's Mo Elowanibi, the only Canadian to win an Outland trophy. Did it at BYU after leaving a big impression with the Okanagan Sun. I'd say that UBC's Leo Groenewegen is my 1A in that group. Middle group, got to go with Romberg for the reasons Mike mentioned. But if you want to talk about Husky grad Scott Flory here, you would not be wrong. And there is only one answer about the avatar for excellence in the field and in the classroom, and that is LDT. Finalists on our KGN on TSN poll are this: Foundational, Mandrich, Shad, and Elowanibi. Also throw Groenewegen in there. Next gen, Romberg, Beverage, and Flory. And offensive line now, McEwen, Jones, Jackson, and LDT. Vote and vote often on the road to picking the PointsBet Canadian College GOAT. Coming up, it's our NC2A picks. Time for NCAA picks, and Gord, you've been a winner, you've been a loser, and last week you experienced a tie. So let's get you back onto a winning track, shall we?
Yeah, I got the classic push this weekend as Wake Forest loses by exactly 3 points and hits the line even. So I'm going to go down to the SEC, the Grand Old South, and Ole Miss, coming off a non-conference victory against Liberty, is hosting one of their stiffest tests of the season this week in the Texas A&M Aggies. Now, A&M had a couple of shaky losses early on. They lose to Arkansas, they lose to Mississippi State. But since then, they bounced back. They beat Alabama, which is worth noting, I would say. And they have looked very strong the last couple weeks. Whereas Ole Miss is coming off a bit of a cupcake by their standards. Texas A&M is coming off a stiff part of their schedule. They just beat Auburn thoroughly last weekend. They look like they're in top form. A&M, as of right now at least, is about a 2.5-point favorite in this one. I'm going to make the cardinal sin here, guys, of picking against our Canadian guys, but I like the way A&M is trending in this game, and despite the fact Ole Miss is back at home, Matt Corral appears to be healthy again. I like the way that things line up for A&M. I'm picking Texas A&M minus the couple of points in this one.
I would have killed for a push last week, and I'm not going to say anything else. But I will move on and talk about a Canadian and Nick Martiner in Hawaii as they take on UNLV. And the Rainbow Warriors really kind of hit the brakes offensively last week against San Diego State. Very uncharacteristic for them of late. They really seem to have the offense going, and it was a slow day for Martiner as well. I really think they bounce back big against UNLV. Not only do I think they easily cover the 3, I'd be very tempted to look at that over-under as well.
For everyone on Crown Produce Gridiron Nation, we're heading to the playoffs, so let's get out to the game.